So, Daniel chapter 6, we're going to start here in verse 12, which is where we basically left off last week, and go through verse 28. So let's cover first verses 12 through 17. So let's pick up here and read it first. Starting verse 12, then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? And the king answered and said, the statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and said and spoke before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, and he set his mind on delivering Daniel. Even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medians and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. And yes, it is. And a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing might be changed in regard to Daniel. Okay? And here's a picture. There's many depictions. I don't know who, I think it's a painting actually. I think I liked it. My wife picked it out. I like it. And
there are many different versions.
Yeah, there's many.
Yeah, but I like it because that's supposed to be Daniel.
It's supposed to be Daniel there.
How old was he there?
He was about 85.
When he got
that
thrown
one,
in the lion's den?
Yep.
No, I wasn't. I didn't think he was that old.
He was.
Yeah, well, like that one because
Okay.
it actually shows how it's.
Now, I want you first, keep your hand in Daniel 6, but I want you to turn to 2 Chronicles 16. 2 Chronicles 16.
We have access to
2 Chronicles 16. And we're going to look at verse 22. Okay. I'm sorry.
You lost again?
First Chronicles. I just looked at the number wrong. First Chronicles 16:22. First Chronicles 16:22. All right. So.
Doesn't the picture by itself tell a story?
It really does, I think. Notice what is said here in verse 22, 1 Chronicles 16. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. Do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. This is God's position about his special people. But of course, this is exactly the opposite of what's going on here. Now notice back in Daniel 6 that as they start their accusation, of course, they have sent their spies out. They have watched him. He's on his rooftop in his prayer room. This was a common place to pray. And of course, he hides it in no way. They there go, there he is.
Gotcha.
We got you. And of course, come back and report this to Darius. Now, they really refer to Daniel in a great disrespect, amongst other things, noting that he's their boss. Okay? But of course, what do they say about him? They say, let's look at the words. they say, verse 13, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you sign, but keeps making his petitions 3 times a day.
In other words,
You know.
God instead of the king.
Yeah, it's been 70 years this man has been first in the Babylonian Empire as an important official, and now the last few years in the Persian Empire. He's a very well-known person. Matter of fact, I have this book. It's a fantastic resource. It's called Ussher's Book of History, and you've seen it. It's a compilation of documents that Ussher had access to in the 1500s, many of which we no longer have. But he had access to them, and he had quotes from them. And there's multiple references from the Greeks and from other places around the world where historians talked about the wisdom of Daniel. So it wasn't like Daniel was just known for being a Jew, okay? He was known as an administrator, bureaucrat in 2 administrations, and he was known for being extremely wise. So, but of course, look how they do that. And of course, they do it for a reason. It's a tactic. They want to discredit him. They want to minimize him. They want to accuse him. They want to vilify him. Okay? Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Fake news.
Fake news, exactly. It's the same. Same tactic used by human beings if this is their purpose. Now, Darius, of course, realizes that he's been played. And, of course, it says that he was deeply distressed. In the Septuagint version, that's the Greek version of the Old Testament, it says severely depressed is the word lupo, and it means a severe emotional or mental distress. Probably a good way to put it is he was really bent out of shape. He was very upset about what they did and the position they put him in.
Because he liked Daniel.
He did. He did. And you're going to see clearly how much he did. Now, they point out the seriousness of the legal code and the obligation for its terms to be followed. Therefore, Darius regretfully arrests Daniel and sentences him to the lion's pit. But like Ann was saying a minute ago, he makes a very great statement of hope and faith in addressing the situation when Darius says, your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. Quite a statement.
He says it like he means
Yes, he very much did.
and believes it.
Did. And he's going to say some other things towards the end of the chapter that are equally remarkable. Now, the word constant, he says constantly served. Again, in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's the word latruo, and it means one who faithfully day after day. So he's saying about Daniel. Daniel is a man who faithfully day after day follows his God. Okay? Could we only hope that someone one day would say that of us?
So how long had Daniel been serving under
Derek,
Darius, do you think, at this point?
3 years.
3 years, okay.
3 years.
Do you think that he was saying this to kind of because he felt guilty and to justify himself?
I think that he felt great sorrow about what he'd done, and I think he felt anger, and you're going to see his anger come out here pretty quick, about how they trapped him in this matter. You know, but I think he makes a sincere statement. I think he knows how absolutely sincere Daniel is in his faith, and he just knows the sincerity of this man, and he says, I believe your God will save you.
There had to be a belief then in the power of the God of Daniel.
Yes, he says it in multiple ways, interesting in this chapter. So it's quite interesting what Darius says here. Now, looking at this picture. We have archaeological evidence, many examples of it, in digs that have been done, where pits are dug into the ground, and of course were used for the purpose of capital punishment in the Media-Persian Empire. So, we found examples of these. They have a hole in the top. They're dug out. And what we find is they're built with a stone partition, usually in the middle, and a doorway, often that's made of something like wood, that has a lever or a rope on it. They'll put the lions on one side of the partition, keep the door closed, put the individual on the other side, and then from above, open the door. Okay? And that's the way they use this system of capital punishment. So, now typically, these arrangements, these pits, had no cover for the top. It was not typical of them. So, Darius is doing something rather different, and I think for several reasons. It says that he ordered that it be covered with a stone. Not only was it to be covered with a stone, but he uses either a clay or wax seal on the edge and imprints his signet ring, signifying that it's an official edict. Okay? Then he has all of these guys that are the accusers, these satraps and others, use their signet ring and also seal it. In other words, it's a public thing. He's demonstrating to everyone around the edict has been followed. The law has been followed. Nothing secret has gone on
Do you
here.
think he really expected God to step in and wanted that to be proven?
Well, we don't know exactly, but it is very interesting, I think, why he would do it. Why would he put this stone over top? Because it's nighttime. He does it at night. Why would he do it? No one's going to see it. It's interesting, isn't it? Well, I think he did it. Well, I'm going to just conjecture. I think he didn't want anyone going around, and certainly any of these officials at nighttime with lamps and pointing fingers and saying, look what those lions did to that old Jew. I think he just wants to eliminate the possibility that's going to happen, and that he's going to be disrespected further. That's my opinion.
Well, another thing is, if you want to seal something, you need to put your seal on something.
Yes, you do. And certainly he used a stone to do it. So, all right. So let's read 18 through 28. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose with the dawn, at the break of day, and he went in haste to the lion's den. And when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? So, he's not certain, okay, but he sure hopes that Daniel's God has delivered him. And of course, then Daniel spoke and said, O king, live forever. Now, this has got to be a sound of joy to this man, Darius, when he hears Daniel's voice, okay? The unbelievable has occurred. These lions have obviously not killed him. And then Daniel goes on and gives his testimony about it. He says, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they've not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, God, and towards you, O king, I've committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted his God. Then the next part, which is interesting, okay? Verse 24 and following. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them with their children and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples and nations and men of every language who were living in all the land, may peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and the enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay? So let's go through this. So Darius spends a troubled night, it says, and was sleepless. This pastor and teacher named Pritchard makes the statement. He says, better to be a child of God in a lion's den than a king without God in a palace.
Yeah.
Interesting observation by him. I wrote it down for you. Notice, if you want to, turn to Psalm 77. This is it's an interesting psalm because what's said here in Psalm 77 is really not, it's a psalm of trouble. And interestingly enough, it doesn't apply to Daniel. It really applies to Darius. So look at what it says. It says, my voice rises to God and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God and he will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. In the night, my hand was stretched out with weariness. My soul refused to be comforted. When I remember God, then I am disturbed. When I sigh, then my spirit grows faint. Thou hast held my eyelids open, and I am troubled so that I cannot speak. You know, actually David is speaking here about an experience in which he had, but it's really descriptive of very, very much what Darius went through. But it isn't really descriptive of what Daniel went through.
Did Daniel really go through anything?
Well, here's
With
what
his faith?
I think he did, and let me show you what I think he went through. Okay? Now, at the moment of sunrise, Darius hastily returns to see what's occurred. I want you to note that there's a very interesting analogy here between Christ's conquest over death, sealed in the tomb with a massive stone covering opening, and what goes on with Daniel. And in this sense, Daniel, I think, is very much a Christ-like figure. Turn to the book of Matthew. I want you to read, starting in Matthew 27. And let's remember the account here. And I think you'll see the analogy, the parallels. Matthew 27, starting in verse 64, the very end of that chapter. He says, therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day, lest the disciples come and steal him, that is Christ, away, and say to the people, he has risen from the dead, and the last deception will become more than the first. Pilate said to them, that is, the Pharisees are saying this, you have a guard, go, make it secure as you know how. Make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure along with the guard, and they set a seal on the stone. Okay? Same idea. Now, but continue on in chapter 28. Now, after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, so again, see the analogy, the very first sunrise sun rays are occurring, the dawn is breaking. Towards the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, came to look at the grave, much like Darius ran seemingly to look at the lion's pit. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his garment as white as snow. And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. And the angel said to the women, don't be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. But he's not here, for he has risen, just as he said, come, see the place where he was lying. And then, of course, they're told to go quickly tell the other disciples about this event. So we see the parallels here between how Christ was sealed in a grave with a large stone over the opening and a wax seal put on it with a signet ring also. And of course, a similar thing happens with Daniel.
Do you think Daniel saw the angel?
Oh, yes, I think so. Very much. Now, let's notice one thing here also. It would appear that Daniel had a much better night than Darius did. Because Daniel, I believe, spent the night in fellowship with the angel of the Lord. Interestingly, Darius calls Daniel the servant of the living God. That word servant there, if you look at the Greek version of the Old Testament, is the word doulos. It means a bondservant. It's the same Greek word that Paul uses concerning himself in Ephesians 1 when he says, Paul, the bondservant of Christ. And it's also the same word that he uses of Christ when he says Christ is the bondservant of the living God. Okay? In other words, and of course, Darius realized Daniel was no casual, or like I say here in the outline, fair weather believer, but rather he knew that Daniel was devoted and he was a serious servant of God. And Darius claims that his God, Daniel's God, is alive. It's interesting, the word here, devoted, is used 28 different times in the Old Testament, and certainly is in stark contrast to the casual practice of sacrifice that people did to lifeless idols. You know, Daniel's life is a life of sacrifice itself, literally. That's how he lived. Now, I think it's quite interesting about Daniel's greeting to Darius. You know, it's ironic. As I said here in the outline, a dead man, quote, in a lion's den is quite alive, while a living king is spiritually dead. Ironic, isn't it? Turn to Hebrews chapter 7. And I want to read verse 25. Hebrews 7:25. This is the promise, and this is the promise that Daniel experienced too. The author of Hebrews says, hence also he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, that is through Christ, since he always lives to make an intercession for them. I think that the angel of the Lord clearly spent the night in the pit with Daniel, making intercession. In this case, keeping the lions from ever getting near to Daniel. Now think about this. Now the interesting question, of course, that we have to try to answer is, who was the angel of the Lord? So let's look at some verses and try to figure out who this might be. First of all, I think we could ask the question, is it the same person, the fourth person, who shows up in the fiery furnace where Daniel's friends were. Remember? You know, Nebuchadnezzar looks in this fiery furnace and he goes, didn't we throw 3 guys in there? But there's a 4th. And all these guys are walking around, you know, nothing's happened to them. They're not burnt to, that's right. They're not burnt to a crisp. Nothing's happened to their clothes. Of course, when they come, he actually has to tell them to come out. Come on out of there, you know. And when he tells them that, they notice that there's not even the smell of smoke on their clothing. It's very interesting. Now let's look at some verses. Turn first to Numbers, all the way back, the 4th book of the Old Testament in the Torah, Numbers 20. Look at some references here and see if we can find out who this angel of the Lord is. Numbers 20, verse 16. Israel is marching towards Moab. Of course, Moab, the Moabites were their famous enemies. Verse 16, but when we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent an angel and brought us out from Egypt. Now behold, we are at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. So he's saying not only did this angel lead them out of Egypt, but this angel is now coming with them and protecting them as they are in this enemy territory of the Moabites. Turn to 2 Chronicles. Keep going to your right now, past Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua. And go to 2 Chronicles. And let's look at way back at the end of chapter 32, 2 Chronicles, and verse 21. 2 Chronicles 32. Let's read both 20 and 21. This is about King Hezekiah. Of course, he's having a real problem here. He's crying out to the Lord. But King Hezekiah and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, prayed about this and cried out to heaven. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed every mighty warrior and commander and officer in the camp of the king of Assyria. So there is a tremendous miracle where this angel of the Lord destroys what later I believe we're told is, over 130,000 Assyrian soldiers instantaneously in one night. Okay? That certainly is a powerful work.
Yeah.
Look at Psalm. Just keep going to the right. Go to Psalms. Go to the 34th Psalm. Psalm 34. And let's read verse 7. He says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues them. How about that? He camps around those who fear him and he rescues them. Keep going to the right.
That's interesting. That's very direct reference.
It is. Keep going to the right to Isaiah 63, towards the end of Isaiah's chapter, Isaiah 63. And look at verse 9. Now let's read 8 and 9. This is a confession of God's people here. In 8 it says, For he said, surely they are my people, sons who will not deal falsely. So he became their Savior. And in their affliction, he was afflicted. And the angel of his presence saved them. And his love and in his mercy, he redeemed them.
The angel of his presence.
The angel of his presence saved them. Okay? And clearly, it says in verse 8, he became their Savior. So it connects the angel with being Christ, the Savior. Okay? It's a pretty strong verse there. Now let's turn to two examples of this, interestingly, in the New Testament. Turn to the book of Acts. And first we're going to read Acts 12. This is this interesting event which occurs where Peter has been arrested and he's put in jail.
No one believes.
Okay? And so he cries out to the Lord, and well, let's start maybe in 7, verse 7. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and roused him, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to them, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought maybe he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. Now there's a series of miracles. Okay?
Are they
Shackles.
really miracles,
Shackles fall off your hands.
but God's there doing that.
Yes,
He's making that decision.
absolutely. And he's countermanding the laws of nature. He's undoing things that are fastened. He's blinding guards that can't see them, so they walk past. He's miraculously opening a jail cell door without anyone having to push it open, so that they walk through.
Is it fair to say, since God created the nature, is what you, Norman, was talking about. Since God created the nature, what's miracle for us is not really a miracle for God,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Is it
Right.
fair to say that?
Right. God does what he does. God has power over all matter, over all structure, over all molecules, over all atoms, and he changes them as he chooses to change them at the time he chooses to.
So it's just miracle for us, human beings,
Sure.
our limited,
Right.
you know,
Wasn't it
perception.
dictatorial of Apollo 13? And they're stuck on the opposite side of the moon. They have chaos inside the device that they're flying in. And suddenly, miraculously, one of the engines fires off. And the next thing you know, they've got the ability to go around. And all three of those guys were Christians.
Yes, absolutely true.
It's a good example.
It's a perfect example of what actually occurred. I mean, we're all
Yeah.
old enough to realize,
Oh, yeah.
remember when that occurred.
Yes, it was. It was a miraculous thing. Here's the last example of this. I'll show you. It's in Acts. Go to Acts 27. This is Paul. This is when he's in the process of being sent back on a ship to Rome to be tried for his, quote, crimes of talking about Christ and, quote, stirring up trouble, ruining the Pax Romana. So, in verse 23, "For this very night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me, saying, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has spoken to all those who are sailing with you.'" And of course, if you read the story, it's very interesting. You have a shipwreck, and of course, Paul rallies them together, and they're saved from this wreck. Now, there's a very interesting quote by a theologian named Strauss, and I think it's important, and I want to illustrate it going back to Acts 12. So if you want to, go back a few pages to Acts 12 again. I want to show you what we consider to be the enigmatic nature of God's will. It's not enigmatic to God. It just seems enigmatic to us. Okay? And let me read the quote first. He says, "A man of God in God's will is immortal until his work on earth is finished." Isn't it a great quote?
Mm-hmm.
Now notice the example here. In Acts 12, let me read the first 2 verses. "And now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat or persecute them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword." Okay?
Now, James, the brother of John, is that? No, never mind.
It's not the half brother of Jesus. This
No,
is a different one.
Yeah.
But James was a prominent preacher and teacher in the Jerusalem church.
Mm-hmm.
Herod, of course, is annoyed by all of this. He arrests him and has him killed by the sword. Okay? James's life is over. Okay? But notice what happens literally at the same time, and we just read it. Okay? Look at again Acts 12 and verse 11. "And when Peter came to himself, he said, 'Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod, from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting.'" Literally in the same time frame. One apostle is killed by the sword, and the other apostle is taken by an angel and released from the jail so he can go forth and continue to preach. So James' time was up, but Peter's was not. And no jail was going to hold Peter because God had things that Peter was going to do. Same with Paul. There were things Paul did all kinds of miraculous things, and miraculous things happen in Paul's life because that was God's will for him at that time.
Can you clarify your point?
My point is that many times God's will seems like an enigma. Why would, I keep saying to myself, I love Keith Green. I listened to his album today many, many times. I love his music. Keith Green died in his 30s, I believe. He was an unbelievable musician. And you find yourself thinking, why? Why couldn't Keith Green have lived till he was 50 or 60 and written more music? Well, because apparently that was the impact that God wanted on the world from Keith Green. And when Keith Green had written a number of songs that God had him write, God took him home in a plane wreck. Okay, is how Keith Green died.
And who we are to argue with
Right.
God.
You're not going to die till God says you're going to.
Exactly. You're not going to die until God says it's time.
One of
A
the
good
sisters-
example is Gary's mom.
Yes.
How many people prayed for that, and God took her when she thought.
But yesterday?
The,
Was it
I think
yesterday?
it was a couple days.
Couple days ago. Okay.
They're gonna be dead.
All right. Yeah.
One of the teachers over at school was engaged to Keith Green.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Robin Cooper.
Huh. Before he met Melody and they got married. And,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Interesting. Okay, well, let's finish this chapter up. Back to Daniel. We see here now that the tables are turned.
Can I just say, because I have to go start the oven?
Yes.
I know it happened earlier, but I think it really stings. If you did something bad, they shouldn't be killing her for your stupid mistake. And your kids on
Okay.
top of it.
All right. Now,
That's just what I mean.
let's look at that.
I missed that.
So, okay, she's making a point
Yeah.
about Medea Persian law, and actually a lot of ancient law. Okay, it's not just Medea Persia. The accusers are now brought before Darius, and we see now what we in the Bible call the principle of reaping and sowing. Okay, Matter of fact, look at it. Go to Deuteronomy 19. Go back all the way to the 5th book. God starts out very quickly in what he writes, the principles he writes. Deuteronomy 19, starting in verse 16. He says, if a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, hello? Isn't that what we're talking about? Okay. Then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and judges who will be in office in those days, and the judges shall investigate thoroughly. And if the witness is a false witness and who has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge evil from among you. The point is, you're going to reap what you sow. If you start doing an evil, you could end up realizing that the evil turns back on you. Haman. Many examples of this, but certainly Haman is one good example in the book of Esther.
Do you think they threw the wives and kids in there to make it more discouraging for them to do the bad?
Yes, well, for several reasons, I think. It seems harsh, clearly, that they did this. But when you read Medea-Persian law, just like you read here in the law of God, you take a risk when you falsely accuse someone. And if you are found that you lied and you deceived, you're going to have a penalty. It's going to happen, okay? Now, it's even more so in Medea-Persian law. Herodias confirms this, that if you made false accusation, then your own family will pay the price, not only you. Matter of fact, Herodias also writes about the Greeks. Same thing. If you were found to be treasonous against the Greek government, not only would you be killed, but your family also would pay the penalty too.
Think about that example from the book of Joshua we learned. Remember the guy stole
Achan.
Achan?
Yes.
Yeah. The whole family was.
That's right. And of course, in that case, we also have implication that the whole family knew what he'd done.
Right.
And no one, instead of saying it and confessing it, they made Joshua go through the whole process of God, throwing the lot and then coming by tribe and by family and by group until finally God points his finger and says, you, sir, you are the one. So the point is that it's only interestingly in the Old Testament that we have a generosity. Since you're in Deuteronomy, turn over a few chapters to Deuteronomy 24 and look what God says about this. Look at verse 16, Deuteronomy 24. It says, fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sin. So God's law is much more generous and much more merciful. But the Medea-Persian one and the Greek one and many, many other codes of ancient empires was not. Okay? These guys realized when they made this accusation at Daniel the risk they were taking. They knew the codes of the law. They weren't stupid. They were officials.
They were stupid.
Well, they were stupid, but they knew what they were doing, and they knew the risk they were taking. That's the point. So,
They just didn't know Daniel's God.
no, they did not. And notice also, I think it's interesting that the lions were so aggressively hungry, they literally jumped up to grab these people who were being thrown in the pit before they hit the ground. Turn to Proverbs, since you're already in Deuteronomy. Go to your right to the book of Proverbs. Interesting proverb here, I think. Two of them. Go to Proverb 26, chapter 26, Proverbs first. Verse 27, rather literal. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will come back on him.
I can attest to that. Can I, Mikey?
Don't dig a pit unless you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
It can not do well.
Yeah, I can tell you, once you came out of there, you knew darn well I didn't do well.
Turn over to the right to actually also to Proverbs 28. There's another statement here. 28 verse 10. It says, he who leads the upright astray in an evil way will himself fall into his own pit, but the blameless will inherit good. So, the principle of reaping and sowing. Now, back to Daniel. Let's finish this off, chapter 6. Let's read again verses 26 and 27. This is really quite remarkable. Darius now speaks, and he says, I make a decree, in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. And notice what he says. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Okay? It really reminds us of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, doesn't it? Who, after his 7-year learning cycle, makes an edict also posted throughout the entire Neo-Babylonian Empire about the God of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. And of course here he makes some very interesting statements. Darius seems to understand that Yahweh is eternal, that he's personal, that he will bring about on earth an indestructible kingdom, that Yahweh acts for the good of those who believe and trust in him. This is quite a doctrinal statement from a pagan king. He's really got it right. So apparently Darius learned something very, very important in this process. And again, I wouldn't be shocked when we get to heaven if we meet him.
Meet Darius?
Yes.
You think because that was the conversion point?
I think it's very likely. So two pagan kings, both dealing with Daniel, may have ended up founding their salvation as a result of it.
Because of Persian law, how do you think God looked at it when he threw those families and those children in that pit?
I think God looked at it from the principle of again, reaping and sowing. That it was not God's standard. We just read what God's standard was. God's standard would have been that the men that did the accusing would be the ones that would be thrown in, not the wives and not the children. But this is not God's kingdom we're dealing with here.
Pagan.
It's a pagan society of Medo-Persian law. That's what's being enacted, and therefore, that's what happened.
The motive would have been justice, not.
Pardon?
The motive would have been justice.
Yes. Okay. Now, I think it's interesting that what he just read here is quite a statement against anti-Semitism. Think about that. Don't mess with Daniel's God. Okay? Don't mess with Daniel's faith and his God. Revere him. Fear him. Okay? It's really an impressive anti-Semitic statement. And I think it's for a purpose. Because remember, we're a couple years at most here before the Jews are released by the Edict of Cyrus, and they go back to Jerusalem to rebuild both the walls and the city and the temple. Okay? I think Daniel and how God dealt with Daniel through Darius is a shield for them as they go back. Because here, everyone's got the notice. It's been posted all over the place. Don't mess with Daniel's God. So I think that God's using it in this way. And of course, it foreshadows also a future deliverance. We won't look at that, but if you want to, the deliverance we see in Zechariah 14, verses 1 to 11. So it concludes in verse 28. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel was restored to power and prestige in the eyes of both Darius and Cyrus. I think it's really ironic, though, that much like Moses, who helped prepare the people for the promised land, but he was never allowed to set foot in it himself, Daniel was a key figure to prepare and ready the Jews for their release back to Jerusalem, but he himself never saw that city again. So he's almost a Moses figure in this sense. A tremendous person, a tremendous leader God used to prepare God's people for greater things. So, the historical narrative of the book of Daniel is done. The story about Daniel and what happened during his administration in two empires now concludes with the 6th chapter.
So now we go to prophecy.
Now we go to prophecy. We'll talk about prophetic events. We'll talk about some very interesting things through the chapters. And we'll get to also some very interesting history, predictive history. The 11th chapter of Daniel is one of the most amazing elements of predictive history in the entire Bible. And we'll go through it very carefully when we get there. But that'll be a few weeks from now we get there. But it'll be fun to go through. And of course, you know, we're also looking forward to Daniel chapter 9. The most famous Old Testament prophecy ever, probably, and the most mathematical prophecy that was ever given by God. So we'll go through that one too.
So we know that we can trust him.
Right. To the very numbers of